John and I had been friends since childhood. We went through school together, celebrated our successes, and supported each other through tough times. When he lost his business and his home, I didn't think twice about offering him a place to stay. John, you can stay with us as long as you need, I said, patting his shoulder. We'll get through this together. Lisa, my wife, wasn't as enthusiastic. Are you sure this is a good idea? She asked one evening as we prepared dinner. Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of worry in her eyes. He's our friend, Lisa. He needs us, I replied, slicing vegetables with a bit more force than necessary. She sighed, shaking her head. I know, but having him here will change things. Our routine, our privacy, everything. We'll manage, I said, trying to reassure her. It's just temporary. John moved in the next day, bringing only a suitcase and a defeated look. He tried to keep to himself, helping around the house and making sure he wasn't a burden. I appreciated his efforts, and for a while, things seemed to settle into a new normal. But soon, I noticed subtle changes. Lisa became distant, her usual warmth replaced by a cool detachment. She was always too tired to talk, too busy to spend time with me. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the stress of having a guest in our home. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, unusually so. I called out for Lisa, but there was no response. As I walked down the hallway, I heard hushed voices coming from our bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest, a sense of dread washing over me. I pushed the door open and found them sitting on the edge of our bed. Lisa's hand rested on John's, her face soft with concern. They sprang apart when they saw me, guilt flashing across their faces. What's going on here? I demanded, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and confusion. Lisa stammered. He just needed someone to talk to. He's been through so much. John looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. Their words felt empty, their explanations hollow. I wanted to believe them, to hold on to the trust I had always had in both of them. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with each passing day. That night, as we sat at the dinner table, I tried to bring up my concerns. Lisa, we've been distant lately. Is everything okay? I asked, my voice gentle but firm. She avoided my gaze, focusing on her plate. I'm just tired, that's all. Work has been stressful. John chimed in, trying to lighten the mood. Yeah, and I've been a lousy guest, taking up your space and time. I forced a smile, but the tension was palpable. The betrayal was unfolding right before my eyes, and I was powerless to stop it. The trust I had in my wife and my best friend was slipping away, leaving me with a sinking feeling of impending heartache. The summer evenings had a way of wrapping everything in a warm golden glow. After dinner, John and I often retreated to the porch, each of us with a glass of whiskey in hand. It had become our ritual, a moment of calm after the day's chaos. But tonight, the air felt heavy with unspoken words. John swirled his glass, the ice clinking softly. Thanks for everything, David, he said, breaking the silence. I don't know where I'd be without you and Lisa. I took a sip of my drink, the whiskey burning a path down my throat. We're friends, John. We've always looked out for each other. He nodded, staring out at the fading sunset. Yeah, but it's more than that. You've given me a place to stay, a chance to get back on my feet. I won't forget it. I glanced at him, trying to read the expression on his face. You do the same for me, John. We've been through a lot together. John looked down, his fingers tightening around the glass. It's just hard, you know. Losing everything. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. You'll get through this, and we're here to help you. He nodded again, but his eyes were distant, as if he was lost in his own thoughts. We sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the soft rustling of leaves. After a few minutes, John spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa's been great, you know. She's really helped me. More than I can say. A pang of jealousy shot through me, but I pushed it aside. Yeah, she's amazing. She's always been there for us. John smiled, a sad sort of smile. I just don't want to be a burden. I see how much you two are trying, and I don't want to make things harder. I shook my head. You're not a burden, John. We're family, and family sticks together. We fell silent again, the conversation weighing heavily on my mind. I finished my whiskey and stood up, stretching. I think I'm going to call it a night. John looked up at me, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else I couldn't quite place. Thanks, David, for everything. I nodded, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Good night, John. We'll talk more tomorrow. As I walked back into the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. The porch, once a place of comfort and camaraderie, now felt like a stage where unspoken tensions played out. And as much as I tried to reassure John and myself that everything would be okay, the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Inside, Lisa was waiting for me in the living room. She looked up from her book, her eyes searching my face. How's John? She asked. I shrugged, sitting down beside her. He's struggling, but we'll get through this. Together. Lisa reached out, taking my hand in hers. We will, she said, her voice soft but firm. We'll get through this. I squeezed her hand, drawing comfort from her touch. But even as we sat there, side by side, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, and I didn't know if we could ever get it back. The unease that had settled in my gut over the past weeks reached its peak one evening. I came home later than usual, the house shrouded in twilight. I could hear faint laughter from the backyard, a sound that both comforted and unsettled me. Lisa, John? I called out as I stepped inside, my voice echoing in the quiet house. In the back, Lisa's voice floated through the open window. I walked through the house, my footsteps slow and measured. When I reached the back door, I saw them sitting together on the porch swing, laughing at something John had said. They looked so at ease, so comfortable with each other, that it made my heart ache. Hey, I said, stepping out onto the porch. They both looked up, their laughter dying away. Liz's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. David, you're home late. I nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, got caught up at work. John stood up, a sheepish look on his face. I should probably get going. Thanks for the chat, Lisa. As he walked past me, I caught a look in his eyes that made my heart sink. It was a mixture of guilt and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. I turned to Lisa, my mind racing. We need to talk, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I sat down on the porch swing, the wooden slats creaking under my weight. What's going on, Lisa? She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. David, I can't keep doing this, pretending everything is fine when it's not. What do you mean? I asked, my voice tinged with a mixture of fear and anger. John and I, we've grown close. Too close, she said, her eyes filling with tears. It started as just trying to help him through a tough time, but somewhere along the way, it became more. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. More. What do you mean more? Lisa looked away, her voice breaking. I love him, David, and he loves me. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. You've been seeing each other, behind my back? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, David. I never meant for this to happen. But it did, and now I can't ignore it. I stood up, pacing the length of the porch. So what now? You want me to just leave? Let you two be happy together. Lisa stood up, reaching out to me. I know it's a lot to ask, but yes, I think it would be best for all of us. John and I can be happy if you just let us. I stared at her, my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. You want me to just walk away, after everything we've been through? She nodded, her eyes filled with sorrow. I'm so sorry, David. I never wanted to hurt you, but I can't keep living a lie. I turned away, unable to look at her. The betrayal was too much to bear. Fine, I said, my voice hollow. I'll go. As I walked back into the house, I felt a strange mixture of anger, sadness, and relief. The truth was out, and there was no going back. I packed a bag, my mind numb with shock. Lisa didn't try to stop me. She stood in the doorway, watching with tear-filled eyes. Goodbye, Lisa, I said, my voice cracking. Goodbye, David, she whispered, her voice filled with regret. As I drove away, the weight of her betrayal settled over me like a heavy blanket. I had lost my wife and my best friend in one fell swoop, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. The night after Lisa's revelation was the longest of my life. I spent it tossing and turning, unable to quiet my racing thoughts. When dawn broke, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The walls that had once been filled with laughter and love now seemed to close in on me, suffocating me with memories of happier times. I dragged myself out of bed and began to pack. Each item I placed in my suitcase felt like a piece of my heart being ripped away. Lisa's soft sobs echoed from the other room, a constant reminder of the betrayal I could neither escape nor forgive. She appeared at the bedroom door, her eyes swollen and red. "David, please, can't we talk about this? Maybe we can find a way to make it work." I shook my head, unable to meet her gaze. "Lisa, there's nothing left to talk about. You've made your choice. Now I have to make mine." She stepped closer, her voice desperate. "I never wanted to hurt you. I still care about you, David. This is just complicated." I sighed, zipping up my suitcase with a finality that felt like the end of an era. "Caring about me didn't stop you from falling for John. You can't have it both ways, Lisa." She reached out, her hand trembling. "Please, David, don't leave like this." I pulled away, my heart heavy with sorrow and anger. "What other way is there, Lisa? You've chosen John. Now I have to live with that." As I carried my suitcase to the front door, John stood in the living room, looking as miserable as I felt. He tried to speak, but I cut him off with a wave of my hand. "Save it, John. There's nothing you can say to make this right." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I know, David. I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." I stopped at the door, turning to face them both one last time. "You know, I always thought we were stronger than this, that our friendship and marriage could survive anything. But I was wrong." Lisa's sobs grew louder as I stepped outside, the morning air cool against my skin. I loaded my suitcase into the car, my movements mechanical and numb. As I slid into the driver's seat, I took one last look at the house. It no longer felt like home. The drive to the motel was a blur. I checked in, the clerk's polite smile a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. The room was small and impersonal, but it offered the solitude I desperately needed. I collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion and grief overwhelming me. My phone buzzed with messages from friends and family, their words of support both comforting and painful. I ignored them all, too drained to respond. The betrayal was still too fresh, the wounds too raw. As the hours passed, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. How had we come to this? What had I missed? The questions swirled in my mind, but no answers came. Only a deep, aching emptiness. Later that evening, I forced myself to get up and take a shower. The hot water did little to wash away the pain, but it was a start. I dressed and ventured out to find something to eat, the motel room too stifling to endure any longer. I found a small diner nearby and settled into a corner booth. The waitress, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, brought me a cup of coffee. "Rough day?" she asked, her voice gentle. I nodded, offering a weak smile. "You could say that." She patted my shoulder, her touch comforting in its simplicity. "It'll get better. Just take it one day at a time." Her words were a small comfort, but they were enough to keep me going. As I sipped my coffee and stared out the window, I realized that I had a long road ahead. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I would get through this one day at a time. And maybe, just maybe, I would find a way to heal. The weeks following my departure were a blur of emotions. I threw myself into work, hoping to drown the pain in endless projects and meetings. But every quiet moment brought back the haunting memories of Lisa and John. I knew I couldn't move on without confronting them one last time. One Friday evening, after a particularly grueling day at the office, I decided it was time. I drove to the house, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and resolve. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Lisa opened it, her face a mixture of surprise and fear. "David, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm. She stepped aside, letting me in. The house felt different, colder somehow. John was in the living room, his expression mirroring Lisa's. He stood up as I entered, but I motioned for him to stay seated. I need to get some things off my chest, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. Lisa nodded, sitting down beside John. Go ahead, David. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. I've spent weeks trying to understand what happened, trying to make sense of the betrayal, and I realized that I need to know why. Why did you do it? How could you betray me like this? Lisa's eyes filled with tears. David, it wasn't something we planned. It just happened. We were both vulnerable, and things got out of hand. John looked at me, his guilt evident. We never wanted to hurt you, David. It was a mistake, a horrible mistake. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my composure. A mistake? You call falling in love and betraying me a mistake? Do you have any idea how much pain you've caused? Lisa reached out, but I stepped back. I know, David, and I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen, but it did, and now we have to live with the consequences. I shook my head, anger and sorrow mixing in a volatile cocktail. Living with the consequences? You mean living with each other, while I pick up the pieces of my life alone? John stood up, his voice pleading. David, please. We never wanted to hurt you. We care about you. You're our friend. I laughed bitterly. Friend? Friends don't do this to each other. Friends don't destroy each other's lives. Lisa's tears flowed freely now. David, please. We want to make things right. We want to help you. I looked at them both, the people I had once trusted with everything. You can't make this right. The damage is done. But I need you to know that despite everything, I don't hate you. I just can't be around you. They both nodded, their faces etched with regret. We understand, Lisa said softly. We just want you to find peace. I turned to leave, pausing at the door. I hope you find it too, but not at my expense. As I walked out of the house, a strange sense of relief washed over me. I had faced the truth, confronted the people who had hurt me the most. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave me a sense of closure. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally start to heal. Back at the motel, I sat down with a glass of whiskey, the weight of the evening settling over me. The confrontation had been painful, but it was necessary. I knew I had a long road ahead, but I was ready to take the first step. One day at a time, I would rebuild my life. And maybe, just maybe, I would find a way to forgive, not for their sake, but for my own. Months had passed since that painful night when I confronted Lisa and John. The initial shock and anger had given way to a dull ache, a constant reminder of what I had lost. I had moved into a small apartment, trying to piece my life back together. But every now and then, the regret crept in, gnawing at the edges of my mind. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself sitting on the couch, a photo album in my lap. The pictures told the story of happier times, holidays, birthdays, and random moments of joy. I lingered on a photo of Lisa and me at the beach, our smiles wide and carefree. The memory was bittersweet, a stark contrast to the reality we now faced. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my reverie. It was a message from an old friend, Mark, who had been my confidant throughout this ordeal. He had suggested meeting up for a drink, sensing that I needed to talk. I agreed, hoping the distraction would help. We met at a quiet bar downtown. Mark was already there, nursing a beer. He looked up as I approached, his face breaking into a warm smile. David, it's good to see you. I nodded, sliding into the seat across from him. You too, Mark. Thanks for meeting me. He raised his glass. Anything for an old friend. How have you been holding up? I shrugged, signaling the bartender for a drink. Some days are better than others. It's just hard to let go, you know. Mark nodded sympathetically. I get it. It's not easy, especially when you've invested so much in a relationship. I took a sip of my drink, the familiar burn of whiskey providing a strange comfort. It's not just about the relationship, Mark. It's about the trust. I trusted them both, and they broke that trust. He leaned forward, his expression serious. Have you thought about forgiving them? Not for their sake, but for yours? I sighed, swirling the ice in my glass. I don't know if I can. Every time I think about it, the anger and hurt come rushing back. Mark placed a hand on my shoulder. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting David. It just means letting go of the burden. You deserve to find peace. His words lingered in my mind long after we parted ways. As I walked back to my apartment, I realized that maybe Mark was right. Holding on to the anger and regret was only prolonging my pain. That night, I sat down at my desk and wrote a letter. I didn't plan to send it, but I needed to get the words out. I poured my heart onto the page, addressing both Lisa and John. I told them about the pain they had caused, the trust they had broken, but also about my desire to move forward. As I wrote, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I realized that forgiving them wasn't about excusing their actions. It was about freeing myself from the chains of bitterness. By the time I finished, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The next day, I decided to visit the park where Lisa and I used to go. It was a place filled with memories, both happy and painful. I found a quiet spot under a large oak tree and sat down, the letter in my hand. I read it aloud, my voice steady. As I spoke the final words, I felt a tear slide down my cheek. It was a tear of release, of letting go. I folded the letter and tucked it into my pocket, feeling a sense of closure. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. I knew the road ahead would still be challenging, but I was ready to face it. I had confronted the truth, acknowledged my regrets, and taken the first step toward healing. As I walked back home, I looked up at the sky, the sun breaking through the clouds. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to start over. And in that moment, I knew I would be okay. One day at a time, I would rebuild my life. And maybe, just maybe, I would find happiness again.